I agree. Okay, so can we give Cami another round of applause online and in person?
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for starting off our seminar on such a high note or should I say, transcendent note. So we're going to move on to our second paper. So it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Leah Grosen Jørgensen, who is a reviewer and author with a PhD in comparative literature from Aarhus University, where she was part of the project Medievalism in Danish Romantic Literature. Her main research topics include reception of Old Norse and Old English literature in Romantic and contemporary culture, and her work has been published in Grundtvig Studia Romantic and at Aarhus University Press. She has taught university courses about the historical context and reception of Beowulf, and has frequently included J.R.R. Tolkien's work in her research and dissemination. Leah, welcome.
Hello. Thank you, everyone, both those of you who are present and also those of you who are watching online. I feel very privileged and thankful for presenting at this seminar. So a huge thank you to all of you and also to the organizers for this opportunity. Now, while I do consider myself a big fan of Tolkien's fictional work, because yes, I must admit that I am more familiar with his contribution to Old English studies, particularly his groundbreaking work with Beowulf. This famous poem was, of course, first translated in full and published in the 19th century. And consequently, the criticism surrounding Beowulf was heavily influenced by political and national medievalism and Romanticism. This topic has been studied brilliantly by Beowulf and Tolkien scholars like Tom Shippey and Andreas Haarder. However, as my title suggests, I will narrow my focus to the Romantic aesthetics during Beowulf's initial reception. And to be more precise, I will examine the concept of the poetic genius and whether this aspect of Romanticism has remained in Tolkien's Beowulf criticism, namely his essay, The Monsters and the Critics from 1936. The subject of my paper, the subject of my paper is partially inspired by my PhD, my former teaching in Beowulf, and of course also my fondness for the poem. I find this question of the poet particularly interesting because Beowulf really is a text that addresses the act of poetry on at least 3 different levels, as I have tried to demonstrate with this model. Firstly, in the inner part of the circle, Beowulf, of course, features poets or court poets who primarily sing in King Hrothgar's hall Herod. They are celebrating Beowulf, and they also refer to both Christian and legendary material. On our second level, in the middle, we also have characters who possess poetic skills. And much like the court poets, they draw on myths or history to express themselves. For instance, when Hrothgar, he refers to the mythical King Hermod to warn Beowulf of the dangers of excessive pride. And later in the poem, we also have a Geatish woman who sings in mourning during Beowulf's funeral pyre after he has fought and slain the dragon. Finally, on the third level, on top, we have the anonymous poet behind Beowulf itself. And just for simplicity's sake, I will treat the author and the poem's narrator synonymously in this talk. More than once, this author/narrator poet, he talks in first person, so he makes his readers or listeners conscious about his storytelling. And most importantly, the author also presents the heroic material through a Christian lens, which I think gives the poem an almost metatextual complexity. I will return to this model during this paper, beginning with a short description of the Romantic genius. Then I will present the description of the poet in the introductions to the first three full translations of Beowulf from the 19th century in Latin and Danish and English, respectively. I will then do a more thorough analysis of Tolkien's Beowulf essay and his relationship with the poet. And I will finish with short comparisons to some of Tolkien's 19th century predecessors, as well as his own fiction or legendarian. And I believe this can lead to some very interesting discussions with you. But first, let's look at the Romantic genius. So according to works by M.H. Abrams and Johan Smith, the Romantic genius as a concept is a product of philosophical and political developments during the late 18th century. On this map, I have pinpointed some of the notable writers who either directly or indirectly contributed to the genius concept. And as you can tell, it was very much a transnational effort. Smith writes that generally the genius is a symptom of an aesthetic revolt against neoclassicism, which had dominated European art at this point. As the name suggests, neoclassicism valued art and literature that followed norms and principles from classical masters like Homer and Horace and Vergil, etc. However, a more individualistic and subjective form of art and view on art and nature began to emerge in the 18th century with climate and nature theories from Jacques-Louis Montesquieu and Jacques Rousseau, and later with magazines like Joseph Addison's The Spectator in England. And like his English countryman, Addison argued that instead of copying the classics passively, poets should break literary norms. They should trust their own imagination, however irrational, chaotic, or unconscious it might be, in order to create something new. And these ideas gained much attention among German writers with the Sturm und Drang movement. These authors argue that rather than compare each text to the classics, one should read each piece of literature on its own merits and reward the poet for his originality. Some of these theories also found resonance in Denmark, although with less impact than in Germany. There were German authors Heinrich Klopstock and Friedrich Gerstenberg who were stationed in Copenhagen in the late 18th century and sort of carried with them some of these ideas. Later, there was also Henrik Steffens, who had studied in Jena and who also presented these romantic ideals in very famous lectures at the University of Copenhagen from 1802 to 1803. The genius really presented a new literary ideal. This type of poet is a special individual who does not necessarily need training, but he is born with the gift of poetry and he enters almost a divine realm, apropos Camus' paper from before. And much due to Johan Haarder's essays on literature and poetry, the genius also contains what I would call an exceptional duality, as I have tried to illustrate here. While the poet's poetic inspiration is universal, divine to some extent, his expression is individual. And this means that this genius reflects his own specific time and culture. And this cultural relativism led to a newfound appreciation for medieval vernacular literature and, of course, old poets, whether they be authentic or fictional. Most famous were, of course, the immortal bard Shakespeare and the Scottish Ossian, who had their own cult following and whose works were regarded as glimpses into the nation's unique past and cultural identity. And this was also the case with Beowulf. Despite having an anonymous author, the poem was quickly regarded as a precious testament to ancient Danish, Germanic, or English language and culture. Moving on to the first translation, which came in 1815 from Grímur Jónsson Thorkelin. He was born in Iceland, and he was led ahead of the Danish Royal Archives. And as you can tell by the title here translated into English, his introduction is marked by his patriotism and his strong ties to the Danish monarchy. But it's interesting that quite early on, Thorkelin comments on the Beowulf poet, claiming, and I quote here, that the author was an eyewitness to the exploits of King Hrothgar, Beowulf, and Hygelac, and was the eulogizer at the funeral of Beowulf, who died in Jutland in the year of our Lord 340. Quite radical, and this theory was quite quickly dismissed shortly after Thorkelin's publication, but it really demonstrates the translator's need to place the Beowulf poet in a historical reality. If we remember our model from before, I think it's fair to say that Thorkelin somewhat blurs the layers. He interprets the poem as an authentic account from an unknown poet, whom he even refers to as the divine bard of the Danes. This remark perhaps hints on the genius theory, I would say, but Thorkelin does not elaborate, or he doesn't really directly comment on the poem's literary quality or lack thereof. By comparison, Thorkelin's successor, N.F.S. Grundtvig, acknowledges the poem's artistic and historical value. He presents it as, and I quote here, a peculiar art attempt and a memorial to Anglo-Saxon poetry and song language. He even uses the word skjaldskab, which is sort of like a Grundtvigian Old Norse inspired word. Now, with the word art attempt, Grundtvig explains that the poem nevertheless suffers from being incohesive, and it also suffers from combining history with fantastical fairy tale elements. But Grundtvig does, however, praises the poet's historical knowledge and that there is truth in Beowulf because it represents mankind's heroic struggle against the powers of darkness. And because Grundtvig also notices the author's Christian interpretation of pre-Christian legends, I would suggest that his reading maintains the three layers, especially if we compare to Thorkelin's from before. And while Grundtvig concludes that the poet has expanded his own knowledge on language and history, Grundtvig, he does not present the poet as a divine genius or per se, but rather the poet is a skilled poet or skald who sends a universal theme and made an impressive but nevertheless a flawed heroic poem. Our final introduction comes from John Mitchell Kemble, who is an acolyte of Jacob Grimm. And Shippey and Haarder has explained that Kemble's attempt to tie Beowulf to Germanic rather than Norse literature and mythology, it really marked a paradigm shift in Beowulf studies. So consequently, Kemble incorporates the poet to support his pro-Germanic argument, claiming, for example, that some Norse stories, like the ones I've just inserted here, they were not known to, and I quote, the author of our poem. These legends in Beowulf, they are more independent, and they are more coming from an Anglo tradition rather than an Old Norse one. I think it's also telling that Kemble only includes another Old English poem, Vitsith, or the Traveler's Song, as he calls it, not because it features a self-conscious poet/narrator, but because it refers to a genealogy of kings. So because of this, I would say the layers within Beowulf are once again blurred. Much like Thorkelin, less like Grundtvig, Kemble's introduction really reflects the 19th century tendency to prioritize Beowulf's historical, pagan, or pre-Christian content. The poet is mostly a point of interest only insofar as the translators can identify the poem's origin. And this perception, of course, was heavily challenged by Tolkien in his essay, where he gives the anonymous poet some well-deserved attention. So Tolkien begins by confronting this tendency to study Beowulf through a historical, philological, archaeological lens, but not as a work of art. He also addresses the literary judgment of Beowulf, and given Tolkien's summaries, it seems that most scholars have followed in Grundtvig's footsteps by claiming that the poem suffers from its blend of history and fantastic poetry. Tolkien, however, insists that the Beowulf poet used his historical sense with a poetical object in mind, and that the fantastical elements, the monsters, that is, are important because they give the poem a very clear structure. Throughout his essay, Tolkien expresses respect for the Beowulf poet to such an extent that it becomes, I would say, almost empathetic. The main goal is to put himself in his reader and his reader in the poet's position to fully understand and appreciate the aesthetic value of Beowulf. So there's an empathy going on there. Tolkien's identification with the Beowulf poet has been demonstrated by other scholars like Jane Chance and Mary Faraci. And I propose that Tolkien's sentiment can also be interpreted with the genius theory in mind. For instance, Tolkien refers to the poet as a greater man than most of us who lived in a time with room for myth and heroic legend and for a blend of these. And I think this combination of universal imagination and poetic expression formed by historical circumstances, this is what I earlier referred to as the genius's duality. And this duality is brought forth by Tolkien, who, though wrapped in a quite an ironic remark, as you can see on this slide, but he writes that what critics have deemed a defect in Beowulf is in fact the poem's strength. That its author, coming in a time rich in the legends of heroic men, has used them afresh in an original fashion, giving us not just one more, but something akin yet different, a measure and interpretation of them all. And I think Tolkien's vocabulary here echoes perhaps some of the genius theory. Original fashion and something akin yet different are quite, I think, noteworthy remarks. Tolkien goes on to elaborate that the universal theme in Beowulf is mankind's mortality, best represented by Beowulf's fight with the monsters. And Tolkien also underlines that the poet chose to set his story in ancient times because it was poetically appealing. So by highlighting the poet's aesthetic use of history and monsters, I would say again, Tolkien maintains the layers in Beowulf. His essay largely contradicts the 19th century introductions, especially Thorkelin's and Kemble's. Instead of focusing on the poet's authenticity and cultural origin, Tolkien writes that it is the mood of the author, the essential cast of his imaginative apprehension of the world, that is my concern, not history for its own sake. I'm interested in that time of fusion only as it may help us to understand the poem. And it's also telling that Tolkien also concludes that the history, that the past that we find in the poem is fundamentally a product of the poet's own imagination. It is the poet himself who made antiquity so appealing, he writes. So again, the poet's skill and his original use of history, those are really front and center. Now, as you have probably realized by now, Tolkien's arguments resonate some of those presented by Grundtvig, who insisted that Beowulf has both an aesthetic and historical value. The similarities between Grundtvig and Tolkien have been documented by others way before me, Kemp Malone, Andreas Haarder, Tom Shippey, Brad Busbee, Sid Bradley, among others. I could go on. Shippey has particularly noted that both Tolkien and Grundtvig took national and spiritual inspiration from Beowulf, and both authors infused myths and legendary literature with their own Christian beliefs, either Protestant like Grundtvig or Catholic like Tolkien. To this, I would add that Tolkien, much like Grundtvig, he identifies with the Beowulf poet and also attempts to follow his example. Like Grundtvig, he is inspired by the anonymous Christian poet, and the way this poet makes antiquity appealing, just to use Tolkien's own words, with his original storytelling. And much like the Beowulf poet himself, Grundtvig's and Tolkien's authorship are very different indeed, but they both consist of a synthesis of pre-Christian and Christian motifs. And I'm also convinced that both authors were very much aware of the religious undertone in the Old English word for poet, shop, due to its etymological time to skypend or creator. One immediately remembers Tolkien's On Fairy Stories, where he refers to the storyteller as a sub-creator. I will end this paper with a stepping stone to a wider discussion about the poet's resonates in Tolkien's work overall. So in my PhD, I argued that an author like Grundtvig had a dynamic reaction to the genius concept as well as his own poetic image. Grundtvig was more open to romantic genius theories in his youth, but eventually he advocated for literature with an intentional historical and spiritual Christian purpose. Likewise, Tolkien seems to adopt some aspects of the genius theory, namely this notion of the poet's ability to express universal themes in an original way. However, Tolkien also presents, I think, a less individualistic view of the poet in his own fiction, where we often have characters who sing and tell stories also to find comfort and strength. And this is the subject of an essay by Alexandra Brolin-Teniau in the anthology Tolkien and the Invention of Myth, edited by Jane Chance, with references to Messiah Eliade's theory of cyclical and mythical time. Brolin-Teniau argues that, like in Beowulf, but with more positive end results, I should say, Tolkien inserts narrative in The Lord of the Rings, which create an echo and an interplay between legend and main story. So I think you might say that storytelling consequently becomes a more collective experience in Tolkien's work, and that the special role of the poet, the genius, if you will, becomes perhaps almost obsolete. Which brings me back to the three layers in Beowulf. I think if we replace the anonymous Christian poet with Tolkien, the characters with those from The Lord of the Rings, for example, and the court poets with the legends of Middle-earth, there's a similar narrative depth that unfolds. And I think if any of the romantic genius theory carries over in Tolkien's work, I find that it is this theory of that imagination, while differing from individual to individual, can have universal meaning. For Tolkien, the poet is not a divine genius, and while the poet's voice is his own, it will always be part of a larger, cyclical, organic process formed by time and language. Thank you.
That was excellent. Thank you so much, Leah, for that paper. And it's lovely to have that kind of transition between Tolkien's fiction and then consider his actual scholarship and how Romanticism kind of comes to play in that field. Because I suppose with medievalism, or medieval studies, I should say, we think of it very much as it is now, but it's not necessarily the same as back when Tolkien was working. So it's really illuminating. Thank you. Do we have any questions immediately in the room for Leah? Sorry, it was just before you, I'm afraid, Andy.
Yes, I mean, I thank you, first of all, for your paper. It was absolutely wonderful. And it's just such a joy for me to get to hear all those names from 19th century to, Beowulf scholarship again. I sort of have sort of two questions for you, but I think I'm going to focus on kind of coming off of what Will said, which is we're so used to thinking about Romanticism in terms of Keats and Shelley and, all of the poets. But making the move to think about 19th century scholarship through the lens of Romanticism is really, really significant and important. And in particular, and your presentation alluded to this, it also comes, it's tied to a nationalistic agenda, right? To sort of find the spirit of a nation. Absolutely. And I'm wondering if you can see an analog with the trajectory of Tolkien's own fiction, where if you go back to the Cottage of Lost Play, he has a bit of a nationalistic agenda to find a mythology for England that he moves very much away from as he develops the Silmarillion. He no longer conceives of it in that way. And I just wonder if you see an analogous relationship there.
Yeah, thank you. Wonderful question. There are several things that I think you can discuss from there. I think when dealing with Tolkien, you really can't separate his scholarly work with his fictional work. I think perhaps, you know, when Tolkien was writing his legendarium, I think it's important to take into context what had happened to Old Norse and Old English literature at the time. As far as I know, after the Second World War, obviously, a lot of scholars hesitated to work with that material or study it because, of course, the Nazis had, you know, used some of these stories and Germanic Old Norse legends in their propaganda. So I think perhaps there's a conscious awareness to tone down the national aspect of it. Even though, as you say, he said he was writing a mythology for England. But I think, so that's, I think, perhaps one of the reasons he stepped away, being very conscious about what happened in the 20th century. And that's also something I've been discussing a bit with my work, because of course you can't blame the 19th century author for what happened, but I think it's also naive to think that, you know, what happened in the 20th century, especially in regards to the reception of medieval literature, it's really building on a foundation set by the Romantic poets, especially this idea that, you know, once literature becomes historicism, which really much happened in the 18th, 19th century, you know, there's a tendency, and I think that's also what Tolkien reacted to with Beowulf, there's a tendency to put history before the art itself. You know, so a poem, which is a poem like Beowulf, becomes a historical relic, you know. So I would say that that would perhaps, taking into account the reception in his own time, I think would be one of the reasons to that. Yeah, I hope that answered your, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Brilliant paper. I was interested in your concentric circles and the fact that, you know, Beowulf clearly was that one, the Christian anonymous Beowulf poet. Because what's always fascinated me, well, one of the things that's fascinated me about Beowulf is the fact that it was written by a Christian poet, and it has what I like to call almost a veneer of Christianity, mainly coming from the Old Testament. You know, it talks about the flood and things like that. And it's interesting because I love that thing that Shippey talks about, you know, this was a period where your grandmother was probably a pagan, you know, and yet he decides to put a veneer of Christianity into it, but clearly not anything from the New Testament at all. So do you have any thoughts on that and why he did that?
Wow, thank you. A wonderful question. I mean, you know, this has been a discussion all the way back from Beowulf's reception. You know, is it a pagan, a Christian poem? I think Tolkien was on the right saying, I think he writes somewhere that, I was also thinking about this, as I mentioned, there are at least 3 layers. I was considering adding perhaps 1 or 2 other layers, like separating the scribe from the author, which I know, you know, this idea that there's a urtext, like a pretext to Beowulf, which was perhaps heathen. And I think Tolkien also writes that it must come from the age of Bede. So right about the time, or at least 100 years after the conversion to Christianity in England. I would say I would agree with most, and I think Tolkien as well, that he writes this is a time of fusion. So I think, you know, given that the poem was written down around, I think around the 1st millennium, that there is, I think, which was so interesting about Beowulf, because there is a respect, I think, to the pagan material in a sense. And as you say, that could be the case with, you know, having an ancestor who believed in this. But I know that there's also, I think it's Roberta Frank, as far as I know, who has argued that it could also be a product of King Canute, and it was written during his reign in England. So not only was it respect to potential ancestors among the Anglo-Saxons, but also as a sort of celebration of this Danish king to sort of legitimize his rule in England, to celebrate, you know, celebrate his Scandinavian forefathers as the poem takes place in Scandinavia, but still, you know, accepting that there is a Christian sentiment. So sort of having your cake and eating it too. I hope that answered your wonderful question. Thank you.